While the exact nature and extent of Jewish proselytism is debated by scholars, the general consensus is that it existed in some form between 500 BC and the 1st century AD. During this period, there appears to have been a massive growth in the Jewish population, based off of the figures of Josephus. But like most estimates of historical populations in antiquity, his figures are probably questionable. There are no records of Jewish missionaries or missionary tracts, and recall that Jews had begun reacting poorly to Christians in the 2nd century, precisely because they were not Jews with incorrect views about the Messiah, but Gentiles who claimed to be the true Israel, as Lawrence Schiffman said. The Jewish Encyclopedia states the following on the matter, quote, "The fervor of proselytism was indeed one of the most distinctive traits of Judaism during the Greco-Roman epoch, a trait which it never possessed in the same degree either before or since. The zeal to make converts, which at first sight seems to be incompatible with the pride of the chosen people, and with the contempt which the Orthodox Jew professed for the foreigner, is attested by numerous documents, and, better still, by facts themselves. Various methods were employed to increase the flock of Israel. The most brutal was that of forced conversion, that is to say, circumcision, such as had been imposed by John Hyrcanus on the Idumeans, and by Aristobulus upon a portion of the Eturians. Next was the conversion of slaves owned by Jews as their individual property, but it was especially the moral propaganda, by word, example, and book, which was most productive of success throughout the whole extent of the diaspora. It must be admitted that Judaism lacked certain of those attractive features which drew the multitude to the cult of Mithras and of the Egyptian deities. Its physical exactions repulsed those wanting in stout courage. Its cult, devoid of imagery and sensuous rites, presented only an austere poesy separating its adepts from the world, and cutting them off to some extent from communion with the cultured. But the practical and legal character of its doctrine, furnishing a rule of life for every occasion, could not but appeal to a disorganized society. The purity and simplicity of its theology captivated the high-minded, while the mystery and quaintness of its customs, the welcome Sabbath rest, the privileges enjoyed at the hand of the public authorities, recommended the Jewish faith to those more materialistically inclined. Moreover, it knew how to insinuate itself by a very clever literature, in part pseudepigraphic, in part apologetic, claiming as its allies and forerunners the greatest geniuses of ancient Greece, the poets, the thinkers, and the sibyls. It also called into play the famous oracles and took on a Grecian aspect, while extenuating or concealing under the mantle of allegory and symbol those dogmas and observances that were shocking to rationalism. In brief, it was a religion essentially supple and elastic under an appearance of rigidity, and one which knew how to be at once authoritative and liberal, idealistic and materialistic, a philosophy for the strong, a superstition for the weak, and a hope of salvation for all. Unfucking quote. This entry has a number of striking revelations. Whenever we encounter cases in the Middle Ages of Jews circumcising Christian slaves, we might view them as the direct counterpart to forced baptisms. This entry also claims that the appeal of Judaism to voluntary converts was, in part, based on the privilege granted to it by greater society. A curious assertion indeed, since the common accusation against Gentiles is that they rejected and confined Jews to the lowliest places in society. To be fair, this is mostly in reference to the period between 500 BC and 100 AD, and it wouldn't be until around the time that the Jews compiled the Talmud in 500 AD that anti-Jewish sentiments began to manifest more notably. But what I find most fascinating in this entry is that it states that the religion quote-unquote insinuated itself into society, often by misrepresentation in order to appeal to those individuals more materialistic. Pseudepigrapha and materialism aside, out of all the complaints of European Christians toward Jews in the Middle Ages, the most consistent one is that they held Christian slaves and circumcised them. Curiously, as early as the 2nd century AD, when Rome was still pagan, Emperor Hadrian issued a decree banning circumcision in the empire. Antonius Pius later relaxed Hadrian's legislation and made it so that Jews alone could circumcise their sons, but said that they were not to perform the ritual on others. As time goes on, it becomes apparent that Jews continued to circumcise non-Jews regardless. In Italy, during the late 5th century, Pope Gelasius wrote to 3 bishops to investigate a charge that a Jewish slave owner had circumcised and converted to Judaism one of his Christian slaves, contrary to the latter's will. 100 years later, Pope Gregory I expressed concern in a letter that 4 Christians had been ransomed from captivity among the Franks, and yet were now serving as the slaves of Jews at Narbonne. Edward Thompson notes that, quote, Gregory says nothing about the illegality of this. He feels it to be an outrage, but he simply gives instructions that they should be redeemed. The local Visigothic authorities had evidently done nothing, unquote. While these are only 2 examples, they are remarkable. The Pope is essentially unable to protect his religious flock and is at the mercy of local officials who seem unwilling to uphold the law. There are those who would claim this speaks to how tolerant locals were, but I see it as a blatant display of the extent of regional Jewish power and influence. They could literally own, hold, and circumcise Christian slaves regardless of any laws set against it. Not even the head of the Roman Catholic Church could stop them. According to the Jewish Encyclopedia, by the 6th and 7th centuries, Jews had become the chief slave traders in Italy, and were also active in Gaul. The parallels between Italy and Spain are notable. During the early Middle Ages, both had Gothic Arians, Roman Catholics, and Jews spread out along their political spectra. Now, while I'm not aware of any sources claiming that the Jews dominated the slave trade in 7th century Spain, they certainly played a major role in the subsequent regional trade after the Arab conquest. In the 9th century, a little over 100 years after the fall of Spain to the Muslims, Louis the Fair in France is recorded to have granted charters to Jews visiting his kingdom from Al-Andalus, that is, Muslim Spain. He permitted them to possess and sell slaves, provided the latter had not been baptized. The Archbishop of Lyon, however, claimed that notwithstanding this provision, the Jews kept Christians as slaves, citing the instance of a Christian refugee from Cordoba who declared that his co-religionists were frequently sold, as he had been, to the Muslim Moors. The Jewish Encyclopedia also notes that many Jews of the period owed their wealth to the trade in Slavonian slaves. 19th century historian Israel Abrahams confirms this. Quote, in the 10th century, the Spanish Jews often owed their wealth to their trade in Slavonian slaves, whom the caliphs of Andalusia purchased to form their bodyguards. In Bohemia, the Jews there purchased these Slavonian slaves for exportation to Spain in the west of Europe, where they often fell into the kindly hands of Mohammedan masters. The church stirred itself vigorously to buy or confiscate these slaves from the Jewish dealers, but the aristocracy connived at and profited by the trade. William the Conqueror is reported to have brought Gallo-Jewish slave dealers with him from ruin. There was good reason for the solicitude of the church, and for its desire to prevent Jews from retaining Christian slaves in their houses. The Talmud, and all later Jewish codes, forbade a Jew from retaining in his home a slave who was uncircumcised. On the other hand, such slaves were only rarely converted to Judaism. No doubt they often drifted into conformity with the beliefs and practices of their masters, but the chief thing that was expected of the slave was to abstain from work on Saturdays. The Jewish owner, in fact, was forbidden to derive any profit from his slave's disobedience to the laws of Moses. Further, since no Jew might drink wine touched by an uncircumcised person, it was obvious that a slave who had not undergone this rite was a useless encumbrance. But the rite was never forced on the slave up to the 10th century. Curiously enough, the tendency to enforce it grows with the Middle Ages, and we find the curious anomaly that the 16th century finds Jews more resolute in this matter than the 10th century found them. Certainly in the 10th century, any Christian slave could refuse to be circumcised, and in that case, his master was unable to retain him." Unquote. While not everything that Abraham says here is directed specifically at 7th century Spain, what he reveals is nonetheless relevant. He informs us that the Jews before and after the Muslim conquest had motives to circumcise Gentiles without actually converting them to Judaism. In fact, this is a precedent laid down long before the Talmud. As Genesis 17:13 says, quote, "Generation after generation, every male must be circumcised when he is 8 days old, including those born in your household and those purchased from a foreigner, even those who are not your offspring." Unquote. His assertion, however, that a Christian male living under Jewish patronage could refuse circumcision is quite doubtful. If all a Christian male needed to do to be set free or be sold to a fellow Christian was to refuse the rite, it stands to reason that the Jews would have lost a fair amount of male slaves from this fact alone. Also recall that the Jews had been using fictitious bills of sale to circumvent secular and ecclesiastic law to retain their Christian slaves when their ownership of them was outlawed. Thus, they apparently had little respect for the will of the monarchy and the Catholic clergy, let alone a single male slave. On the other hand, many of these slaves were likely born under Jewish patronage and ownership, and likely were circumcised at birth. Thus, many never had a chance to refuse the ritual. Also consider that if a male slave refused circumcision, that probably didn't guarantee the freedom or sale of any of his kin who were also under Jewish patronage. Thus, any adult male would have been under considerable pressure to obey the will of his master. Furthermore, the 9th century Islamic scholar Ibn Cordoba observed and recorded routes of Jewish merchants from the south of France to Spain, and noted the presence of female slaves, eunuch slaves, and young slave boys. There can be little doubt that at least some of these eunuchs had objected to having their genitals entirely removed, and yet their Jewish masters removed them anyway. Supposedly, the second edition of the Encyclopedia of Islam identifies a specific town in Spain where the Jews castrated their slaves and then shipped the survivors overseas, but I have not been able to review the text myself. Either way, eunuchs and European females were in high demand in the Islamic world, and it was mainly Jews who were able to freely travel between Christian and Muslim territories. Now, seeing how the advance of Islam had only just begun in the early 7th century, the Jews in the Visigothic kingdom were probably not selling eunuchs to Muslims. While Sisebut had prohibited the Jews from selling Christian slaves overseas, which might suggest that they had been doing so, it doesn't evidence that the slaves were being made into eunuchs at the time. Whatever the case, the primary concern here is whether or not Christian slaves living under Jewish patronage truly had the freedom at any point in time to reject circumcision or any other religious rite their Jewish masters imposed on them. On matters regarding female slaves, Israel Abrahams quotes 11th century scholar Hai Gaon, after noting that female slaves were converted more frequently than males. Quote, "With the female slave, however, conversion to Judaism was much more frequent and natural. I must find room for one quotation from a Jewish authority of the early part of the 11th century. In certain places, he says, there are only Egyptian female slaves in the market, and the non-Jews permit the Jews, as in Babylon, to buy these and no others. Some of them become Jewesses at once, some after an interval, some refuse altogether to be converted. The Jews have great need of their services in these places. Otherwise, their own sons and daughters would be compelled to carry the water on their shoulders from the springs, and go to the ovens with the non-Jewish maidservants, who are of low character, and thus the daughters of Israel might fall into disrepute and danger." Unquote. Now, Gaon was commenting on Jewish behavior in other parts of the world some 300 years after Visigothic rule in Spain. Nevertheless, Abraham's book is meant to speak broadly on Jewish life in the Middle Ages. Thus, unless he states otherwise, it seems fair to take this as at least somewhat generally representative of Jewish life in the period, regardless of location or year. With this in mind, on page 95 of his book, Abrahams expounds further on the relations between Jewish masters and their female slaves. Quote, "Offenses between Jewish masters and their female slaves did occur, but the penalty exacted by the Jewish authorities was a severe one. The slave was taken from her owner, she was sold, and her price was distributed among the poor. Then the offender was flogged, his head was shaved, and he was excommunicated for 30 days. Or the owner, to escape the penalty of his crime, voluntarily gave his slave her liberty, and recognized her son as his legitimate offspring." Unquote. Concerning this last part, while genetic data on Sephardic Jews are lacking, the data on Ashkenazi Jews show that they carry substantial amounts of Eastern European mitochondrial DNA, meaning that they are descended in large part from Gentile women enslaved and abused by Jewish men. Now, the evidence for this conclusion is admittedly somewhat circumstantial, so it's only fair to give another explanation. Entry into Judaism set the bar quite high for men by requiring their foreskin to be removed. No such invasive mutilations, however, were required of female converts. Thus, we might naturally expect there to be more female converts from this fact alone. However, Jewish author and geneticist David Reich highlighted in his book, Who We Are and How We Got Here, that African Americans' European admixture mostly comes from European men, and suggests that this was due to the inequitable power that white men had over black female slaves. He posits the same mechanics of social inequality as the explanation for why the European ancestry of mestizos in Latin America is largely from males as well. If we accept Reich's explanation in these cases, it seems only fair to apply the same mechanics of social inequality to explain the disproportionate presence of European mitochondrial DNA within parts of the Jewish diaspora, considering that Jewish men often possessed many European slaves, and that from a religious standpoint, their interactions with Gentile women were otherwise limited. At least on paper, ecclesiastic leaders and Visigothic monarchs had forbade Jews from holding Christian slaves and circumcising them for quite some time when Sigebut assumed the throne in 612. Thus, we are left wondering as to the root cause of his drastic policy changes. Solomon Katz, of course, claims that Sigebut was motivated by greed and wanted to confiscate Jewish wealth. Quote, Sigebut's intolerance has been attributed to the clergy, but against this opinion we must set the disapproval of Isidore of Seville and of the Fourth Council of Toledo, over which he presided. It has been suggested that these measures were forced upon Sigebut by the Emperor Heraclius of the Eastern Roman Empire, and the treaty concluded between them. There is, however, no text to bear out this statement. A similar attempt at forcible conversion, which Fredegar attributes to King Dagobert in Gaul, is of some interest, especially since the discovery of a contemporary document which confirms Fredegar. But the treaty between Heraclius and Sigebut was not signed until 616, so that the connection must be dismissed. All that we know for certain is that Sigebut adopted the measure without consulting any council. We may then attribute the king's resolution either to his own whim or to the desire of obtaining the possession of property by means of confiscation. The constant reference in the Visigothic laws to the confiscation of the property of Jews shows it to be one of the basic motives for their persecution." Unquote. Now, Kant says that Sigebut's intolerance couldn't have been motivated by the treaty with Heraclius, because it wasn't signed until 616. Yet recall that Isidore of Seville's Etymologiae states in one of its chronologies that during the 4th and 5th year of Sigebut's rule, the Jews converted. This lines up the dates almost perfectly. Sigebut's initial laws enacted in 613 might have been entirely of his own initiative, or at least domestic in origin, but perhaps the forced conversions of the extra-legal nature took place much later in 616, after the Byzantines and Visigoths had signed a treaty. But the question naturally arises here: why would the Byzantines want the Visigoths to convert the local Jews? I will attempt to address this shortly, but for now, let us consider the proposed explanation that Sigebut was motivated by greed and the desire to confiscate Jewish wealth. Bernard Bachrach makes a counter-argument to Katz by highlighting that the Visigothic crown made relatively little direct economic gain from Sigebut's policies. Quote, "Jews who converted to Christianity were not subject to economic sanctions. If the Jews complied with the laws requiring them to give up their Christian slaves, the royal fisc still gained nothing directly, and it gained indirectly only if the newly freed slaves became productive tax-paying subjects. The crown benefited from slave-holding Jews only when they refused to free their Christian slaves, whereupon the king could free the slaves and confiscate half of the offender's remaining property. Moreover, if Sigebut's motivation was economic, it seems that his policy was unnecessarily torturous and less than efficient. First, the violation of the law had to be encouraged. Hardly a useful precedent, even when violators are, though in this case they were not, popularly viewed as cancers of society. Second, the royal fisc gained only marginally and indirectly when these laws were disobeyed. And third, more efficient means, such as those devised by later Visigothic kings to benefit the crown economically through the exploitation of Jews, were available, though not employed by Sigebut. Further study of Sigebut's anti-Jewish legislation suggests that it was the king's policy to weaken the political influence of the Jewish community by striking a blow at its economic strength. As Jewish slave owners were deprived of their Christian slaves, those Jews who were engaged in the slave trade were severely handicapped, if not put out of business entirely, while Jews who owned large estates that were worked primarily by Christian slave labor were so disadvantaged that they would have found difficulty in continuing to function. Sigebut's attempt to prohibit Jews from hiring Christian laborers was probably aimed at keeping Jewish landowners from employing the newly freed men and maintaining business almost as usual." Unquote. Bachrach concludes his other work, A Reassessment of Visigothic Jewish Policy, by saying, quote, "In the period from 589 to 711, at most, 7 of the Visigothic kings embraced anti-Jewish policies or encouraged anti-Jewish legislation. During this same period, however, no less than 9 monarchs pursued policies that varied from benign neglect of the Jews to support of the Jews. Throughout the entire period, those kings who pursued anti-Jewish policies faced strong opposition from both lay and ecclesiastical magnates, as well as from the population at large. Furthermore, it was difficult and often impossible to enforce anti-Jewish laws because of their general unpopularity. In short, scholars have overestimated the power of the monarchs, put too much faith in the effectiveness of the church councils, and grossly underestimated the importance and strength of the Jewish community. The Jews were a formidable force in a kingdom riddled by factionalism, fragmented by localism, and devoid of strong monarchical institutions. Visigothic monarchs who promulgated anti-Jewish laws and demanded the church councils to do the same were seeking to weaken the crown's political enemies. These monarchs were neither religious fanatics nor the pusillanimous instruments of pious bishops." Unquote. I largely agree with Bachrach's assessment of Sisebut's political motivations. However, I do question how much opposition to anti-Jewish legislation there was within the general population. To my knowledge, there are no sources outlining exactly how the common people felt one way or another. The evidence in the sources might suggest that opposition was mostly the result of Jewish bribes and gifts to nobles and clerics. Bachrach may have derived an erroneous conclusion that this somehow indicates a general reflection of the larger populace. Strategically placed bribes within a political structure can result in wildly disproportionate power that does not necessarily reflect popular sentiment. Regardless, there was a definite pattern of alternating pro-Jewish, anti-Jewish policies from Sisebut in 612 right up until the Muslim invasion in 711. Sisebut was succeeded by his son Recared II, who ruled for no more than a year before he was overthrown or succeeded by the pro-Jewish Swintila, whom Solomon Katz describes as, quote, "a mild and just king," unquote. Katz also says that, quote, "he permitted those Jews who had been forced to baptism by Sisebut to return openly to the Jewish faith, and those who had chosen exile to return to Spain." This accords with Swintila's general policy of tolerance and is attested for us by the Jewish historian of the 16th century, Joseph H. Cohen. This information, it must be remembered, is not even remotely contemporary, but it may be derived from some good Jewish source now lost, unquote. Curiously, on the same page as more evidence of Sisebut's forced conversions and Swintila's comparative tolerance, Katz cites the Pseudo-Isidore decretals of the 9th century. Quote, "Among the false decretals of the Pseudo-Isidore is one found issuing from a Council of Seville. It demands that the Jews, who were forced to have their children baptized and who were substituting strange children for them, be watched. The decree is found with several other undoubtedly authentic decrees in the irreproachable part of the collection, in the series of councils called Hispana, which the compiler inserted without modification before the 9th Council of Toledo," unquote. Now, if this portion of the decretals is authentic, as Katz claims, it certainly does speak to the injustices against the Jews in Spain. But curiously, it may also speak to some crimes of their own. Who were these strange children the Jews were presenting for baptism? And why did the Jews have access to them? One can only speculate. As for the mild and just nature of Swintila, the king was praised by many of his time for having crushed the Basque rebellions in the north, and for having driven out the last of the Byzantines. In fact, in reprisal to the Basque rebellions, or raids, depending on your perspective, he forced them to build a town. Isidore of Seville recounts in his Historia Gottorum that, quote, "At the beginning of his reign, Swintila also launched an expedition against the Basques, who had invaded the province of Tarraconensis. There, the mountain peoples were struck with such terror at his coming that they immediately threw down their weapons and freed their hands for prayer, submitting their necks to him as suppliants and giving him hostages, as if aware of his rightful jurisdiction. They built the city of Ologicus for the Goths, with their own taxes and labor, promising to be obedient to Swintila's rule and dominion and to carry out whatever they were ordered to do," unquote. Curiously, Katz and other historians have never thought to accuse Swintila of being quote-unquote anti-Basque. The main difference in how Sisebut and Swintila are viewed by many scholars seems to hinder on how each monarch himself viewed the Jews. Regarding the character of Swintila's reign, there is much contradiction in the sources. Isidore of Seville, who initially praised the pro-Jewish king, wrote in his History of the Goths that, quote, "Beyond this reputation for military glory, there were in Swintila many virtues of royal majesty, faith, prudence, industry, keen scrutiny in judicial matters, and a vigorous concern for government. He was generous to all in his munificence, and quite prompt in his mercy toward the poor and needy. He was thus not only the ruler of the people, but was also worthy to be called the father of the poor." Unquote. However, as Edward Thompson points out, Isidore was the first bishop to sign the minutes of the Fourth Council of Toledo in 633, 2 years after Swintilla was overthrown by Sisinand. These minutes condemned Swintilla and spoke of his, quote, crimes, his, quote, iniquity, and his, quote, accumulation of property at the expense of the poor, unquote. Additionally, the Chronicle of Fredegar, a near-contemporary Frankish source, treats Swintilla harshly as well, and states that he had become a hated figure of Gothic nobles because of his harsh confiscations of property, which in 630 led to Sisinand's rebellion. Thompson also considers, however, the possibility that it may have been dangerous for Isidore of Seville to repeat his earlier praise under the new king Sisinand, and thus signed the minutes regardless of his true sentiments. But it seems equally plausible that Isidore praised Swintilla while he sat on the throne out of fear. Indeed, Swintilla may have murdered Sisebut's son Recared II in order to acquire the throne. It was decided at the Fourth Council of Toledo that in the future, when a king died, his successor must be appointed by the magnates of the whole kingdom, sitting along with the bishops in a common council. Edward Thompson notes that Sisinand indeed had usurped the throne from Swintilla, and says that, quote, by recognizing Sisinand as king, the council contradicted the spirit of its own extraordinarily earnest enactment, unquote. But if the clergy and the nobles had considered Swintilla to be the usurper of Sisebut's son, Recared II, who ruled for barely a year before being dethroned, then perhaps they were not contradicting themselves. Roger Collins considers the fact that Recared II was glossed over by Isidore of Seville in the latter's history of Gothic kings. Quote, on his death, Sisebut was succeeded by a son called Recared. This choice of name is significant in itself, in that it would seem to proclaim some kind of relationship to the former royal house of Leovigild and his descendants. Isidore does his best to skirt over the reign of Recared II, assigning it a length of a few days before death intervened. In doing so, he obscured the regnal chronology of the Visigothic monarchy in these years, and may well have covered up the young king's real fate. At any rate, it seems that, however he met his end, he reigned for more than a few days, probably for a year and 2 to 3 months, unquote. However he acquired the throne, it seems entirely possible that Swintilla began his reign as a mild and just king, but finished it in the opposite manner. It's of note that his own brother deserted him during the rebellion, and defected to the other side. Also of note is that Isidore of Seville died shortly afterwards in 636, and may have simply not been able to get around to editing his earlier entries on Swintilla in his History of Gothic Kings. Kenneth Baxter Wolfe notes in his translations of Isidore's text that there are indeed 2 versions. Quote, 2 versions of the history have survived. The short version, represented by only a few manuscripts, ends with the death of Sisebut in 621. The long version ends in the middle of Swintilla's reign. There has been much discussion about which came first. Most regard the long version as an expansion of the original short version, but some have argued that the short version represents an expurgation of the original longer chronicle, from which all of the positive references to Swintilla were removed, unquote. Putting Swintilla aside, though, Bernard Bachrach describes the anti-Jewish policies of his successor, Sisinand. Quote, Jews were once again prohibited from holding public offices in which they exercised power over Christians. In addition, persons who were born of Jewish parents were also prohibited from holding such offices. Swintilla, in reversing Sisebut's policy, had once again begun to use Jewish officials. Sisinand, in returning to Sisebut's policy, sought to eliminate all Jewish officials in government. Officials who did not dismiss the Jews who had gained such public offices, and officials who appointed Jews to positions of governmental power, were liable to excommunication. Sisinand also struck at Jewish slave traders who dealt in Christian slaves and reaffirmed Sisebut's legislation in these matters. Sisinand tried to bring about the de-Judification of the government, and he sought to weaken the fiscal strength of the Jewish community. Sisinand's approach to purely religious matters was not innovative. He did, however, oppose forced conversions. Nevertheless, those who had converted were not permitted to apostatize, and Jewish proselytizing was handled in the traditional manner, unquote. Interestingly, in order to overthrow Swintilla, Sisinand had sought the aid of Dagobert, the Frankish king to the north, who had recently concluded a treaty with the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius in 629, which entailed compulsory baptism of Jews throughout his kingdom. Heraclius had been engaged in a bitter war against the Persians, whom the Jews were supporting. 18th century British historian Edward Gibbon tells us that in 613, the Persian army took Damascus with the help of thousands of Jews whose, quote, furious bigotry might compensate in some degree for the want of valor and discipline, unquote. The Persians went on to seize Jerusalem in 614 with the help of the Jews and Arabs. Gibbon writes that, quote, the sepulchre of Christ and the stately churches of Helena and Constantine were consumed, or at least damaged, by the flames. The devout offerings of 300 years were rifled in one sacrilegious day. The patriarch Zechariah and the true cross were transported into Persia, and the massacre of 90,000 Christians is imputed to the Jews and Arabs, who swelled the disorder of the Persian March, unquote. Now, I'm not sure where Gibbon got the figure of 90,000, and it may be exaggerated, as most of the figures in antiquity were. But regardless, there probably was a general massacre of Christians, and afterwards the Persians did go on to capture Egypt in 617. Walter Kagi writes in his book that, quote, recent urban unrest in Alexandria and Antioch, which included Jewish-Christian clashes at Antioch, contributed to internal instability, unquote. Greatrex and Leo write in their book that, quote, according to many sources, the Jews were heavily involved in the fighting, although whether as faction members or as opponents of Christians is unclear, unquote. Jacob Nisner writes in his book, A History of the Jews in Babylonia, that there were some 60,000 Christians slaughtered, that the Iranians selected some 37,000 skilled Christian workmen for deportation to Iran, and that, quote, according to the eyewitness account of Strategius, the Jews offered to ransom Christian captives if they would accept Judaism, unquote. The Jews, Arabs, and Persians had become hostile to and were advancing on the known Christian world at the time. Why would Heraclius not begin targeting Jews throughout his sphere of influence, since they were openly hostile to him and Christians? From this, it seems completely plausible that the anti-Jewish agenda of the Byzantines influenced that of Siseba and Sisinand, just as it had Dagobert. Despite the ongoing conflict between the Visigothic kingdom and Byzantium, Edward Thompson informs us that throughout the existence of the Byzantine province, from 552 to 624, there must have been a great deal of movement, both of officials and of correspondence, between southern Spain and Constantinople. He says, quote, indeed, in the letters written by the patrician Caesarius and King Sisebut, we catch a glimpse of East Roman officials traveling to Byzantium in company with a Visigothic diplomat and returning safely. There were also semi-official visitors to the east, like Leander of Seville, who traveled to Byzantium, unquote. In Amnon Linder's translation of the anti-Jewish canons of the Fourth Council of Toledo, he notes that, quote, the council's legislation on the Jews is more extensive than that of the Third Council, 10 canons compared to 1, but it is also of a more innovative nature. While the Third Council reissued previously promulgated regulations, the Fourth Council dealt with the entirely new situation created by the forced baptism imposed on the Jews of Spain by Sisebut, that is, the existence of crypto-Jews, formally baptized and recognized as Christians alongside communities of non-baptized and openly practicing Jews, unquote. Linder asserts that crypto-Jewry was solely due to forced conversions. While I have little doubt that they contributed, and were perhaps even the main contributing factor, it's not entirely out of the question that some Jews had already begun converting willingly, in an outward appearance, so that they might evade the laws forbidding them to own Christian slaves. Remember that, under Swintilla, the Jews were supposedly allowed to return to practicing Judaism openly, but technically the laws forbidding them to own Christian slaves remained in force. Canon 64 of the Fourth Council under Sisinand proclaimed that Jewish converts to Christianity who deviated from the faith should not be admitted as witnesses in public courts. Quote, one cannot be faithful toward men and stand unfaithful toward God. The Jews, therefore, who became Christians formally and have now prevaricated against the faith of Christ must not be admitted to give evidence, even though they declare themselves to be Christians, because they are doubtful as regards human evidence, just as they are suspect concerning the faith of Christ. It is proper, therefore, to invalidate the evidence of those found false in faith, and they must not be believed who have forsaken truth and faith, unquote. While no one could blame a Jew who lied about his true faith after being forcibly converted, a Jew who had converted falsely of his own free will for economic gain, that is another matter. Again, Swintilla, according to Katz and others, had allowed Jews to openly return to their faith, and at this point in 633, this may have been the norm for over a decade. The Fourth Council is speaking of Jews who claimed to be Christian under Swintilla's pro-Jewish policies, despite evidence to the contrary. Also, from a purely pragmatic standpoint, it wouldn't have been altogether unreasonable to bar individuals known to have lied about their religious status for profit. If they were willing to lie about their religion, an extremely serious matter at the time, they might also be willing to bear false witness in the public courts if it suited their purposes. Also note that the law does not bar all Jews or baptized Jews. Rather, it only concerns itself with those converts whom evidence had shown to be unfaithful. The next canon is admittedly not as forgiving. It returns to the policy of Sisebut and bars both Jews and Jewish converts from public offices. Yet it may reveal how both parties were abusing these offices to punish Christians. Quote, "The Holy Council decreed as follows, on the command of the Lord and most excellent Sisanon the king, that Jews and those who were formerly Jews should not seize public offices in any way, because they use this opportunity to harm Christians. The judges of the provinces, together with the priests, shall therefore check their fraudulently neglected infiltration, and shall not permit them to exercise public office. If anyone should permit them this jurisdiction, he shall be excommunicated as a sacrilegious, and the infiltrator shall be publicly flogged." Unquote. Many will claim here that the Jews of whom the Fourth Council speaks were acting in retribution for Sisebut's forced conversions, yet recall that the Third Council in 589, over 20 years before Sisebut had even assumed the throne, proclaimed that it was necessary that the Jews should not act, quote, "in any public office that would provide them with the opportunity to inflict punishment on Christians," unquote. The law promulgated in 589 suggests that this Jewish behavior may have been a problem even before the Visigoths had converted to Catholicism. An additional question arises here. Why did Sisebut convert some Jews and not others? Virtually all the historians agree that there were baptized and non-baptized Jews living side by side within Spain during the reign of Swintilla. Perhaps, as it has been suggested already, some Jews left Spain and went to Gaul, and later returned under Swintilla's more liberal policies. Solomon Katz, however, gives us his general overview of the Fourth Council and perhaps another possible answer to this question. Quote, "At the Fourth Council of Toledo, Sisanon decided that the Jews should not be forced to baptism, but he approved the harsh measure of the same council, which stated that those who had been baptized under Sisebut and had returned to Judaism under Swintilla must be forced to return to the Catholic faith. This view was later accepted in canon law. The same council inaugurated legislation regarding baptized Jews whose orthodoxy was doubtful. These Jews were able, however, to bribe the priests to permit them to observe their own rites. This abuse became so widespread that the Fourth Council of Toledo was forced to enact ecclesiastical penalties against the venal clergy." Unquote. Katz frames the situation as if it were entirely a matter of permitting the Jews religious freedom. Yet the policies enacted at the Fourth Council were addressing Jewish behavior under the liberal policies of Swintilla, who again allowed them to practice their faith openly. The bribes to which Katz refers were likely used more so as a means to retain Christian slaves, circumvent the law, and obtain preferential treatment. Moreover, even Sisebut was not originally intolerant of the Jewish faith. Recall that he said in 613 that the laws issued under Recared, quote, "would be sufficient if the depravity of the Jews had not afterwards corrupted the minds of princes, and they had not demanded and obtained benefits for themselves, contrary to the principles of justice." Unquote. The laws under Recared primarily consisted of three major stipulations. The Jews were not to own Christian slaves, they were not to take Christian women as mistresses or as concubines, nor could they hold public offices with power over Christians, lest they punish them unjustly. Outside of this, they were free to do as they pleased. Here's Linder's translation of the canon of the Fourth Council that pertains to Jewish bribes. Quote, "So great is the avarice of some people that, as the apostle says, while they strive after it, they will stray away even from the faith. Even now, indeed, many of the priests and the laymen have received gifts from Jews and encourage, with their protection, the perfidy of those who are known, and not without reason, to be members of the Antichrist body, for they act against Christ. Henceforth, therefore, any bishop, cleric, or layman who should provide them help against the Christian faith, through favor and support, shall indeed be put under anathema as an impious and sacrilegious, and expelled out of the Catholic Church and the kingdom of God. For it is proper that one who becomes defender of the enemies of Christ should be separated from the body of Christ." Unquote. Note that the law is not expressly designed to attack Jews who are practicing their faith amongst themselves as they see fit. In fact, it's not even targeting Jews per se, but rather any Christians who protect Jews who themselves are engaged in hostilities toward the Christian faith. Curiously, the Fourth Council does make clear attempts to measure their efforts against the Jewish community. As Canon 63 states, quote, "If baptized Jews should later prevaricate against Christ and stand condemned to a certain punishment, it is not proper that their faithful sons should be excluded from their parents' properties. For it is written, a son shall not bear the iniquity of the father," unquote. On the other hand, Canon 60 stated that, quote, "We decree that the sons and daughters of the Jews should be separated from the company of their parents in order that they should not become further entangled in their deviation, and entrusted either to monasteries or to Christian, God-fearing men and women, in order that they should learn from their way of life to venerate the faith, and, educated on better things, progress in their morals as well as their faith," unquote. Charles Joseph Afella notes in Volume 4 of his History of the Church Councils that other versions of this Latin text refer to baptized sons and daughters of the Jews. The canon in question is, without any doubt, referring to the baptized children of Jewish parents who had either been forced to convert under Sisabat or who had converted falsely under Swintilla and then relapsed into Judaism. The preceding canon is expressly concerned with the matter. Quote, "Many who were formerly elevated from being Jews to the Christian faith are now blaspheming Christ, not only by being known to be practicing Jewish rites, but even by daring to operate abominable circumcisions. Concerning these men, the Holy Council decreed as follows: with the advice of the most pious and most religious prince, our Lord Sisanon the King, namely, that such transgressors should be reformed and recalled to the veneration of the Christian dogma by the episcopal authority, in order that the priestly chastisement should correct those whom their proper will shall not amend. Those, however, whom they will circumcise, if they are their sons, they shall be separated from their parents' company, and if slaves, they shall be given liberty in return for the injury done to their body," unquote. It is curious that the Church viewed circumcision as a kind of child abuse, yet only deemed it appropriate to remove children whom they viewed as Christian at that point from parents whom they viewed as apostates at that point. Traditionally, the punishment in Judaism for apostasy was death. Deuteronomy 13, 6-11 states that apostates are to be stoned until they die and receive no pity. While it is certainly tragic that children may have been separated from their parents under Sisanon, assuming the Jewish converts didn't substitute someone else's children in their stead, as the Pseudo-Isidore decretals may suggest, we should remember that a not-so-small number of Christian slaves probably had their foreskin forcibly removed at birth by their Jewish masters, and that the Christians had asked repeatedly that the Jews not do this. Canon 63 addresses interfaith marriages again. Quote, "Jews who have Christian wives in marriage should be warned by the bishop of their city that if they wish to remain with them, they should become Christians. If they were warned and have refused, they shall be separated, because an infidel cannot remain united to one who has transferred to the Christian faith. The sons issued from such marriages, however, should follow the faith and status of the mother. Similarly, also, those born to infidel wives and faithful men should follow the Christian religion, not the Jewish superstition," unquote. Take note that the wording is primarily focused on Jewish men with Christian women, while it addresses a scenario of Jewish women with Christian men almost as a hypothetical. Again, the Jewish community likely would have stoned to death any Jewish woman caught with a Christian man.
זאת הייתה אמורה להיות חתונה פרטית של בני הזוג, אבל החתונה הזאת מסירה את המדינה כבר שבוע ימים, בשל כך היא יהודייה והוא ערבי.
Moreover, the original Latin does not actually use the term wife, but muliere, which can also mean woman or mistress, depending on the context. The Latin vir is its male counterpart, yet Linder translates the words fidelibus viris as faithful men, and infidelibus mulieribus as infidel wives, not infidel women. The term for marriage used here is mulieres in coniugio, a term which may entail something more along the lines of a civic union, which curiously still would have been outlawed by the secular code, and, more importantly, by Jewish law itself. It is interesting that Linder in his initial commentary referred to the Fourth Council as being, quote, of a more innovative nature, unquote. Indeed, as the Jews insisted on violating earlier comparatively reasonable laws meant to protect the Christian community, laws largely paralleled within the Jewish community, the anti-Jewish legislation of the 7th century became more extensive, complex, and sometimes confused in appearance as it tried to address what might be deemed as Jewish intolerance and disrespect.
About 20% of Israel's population is Arab. It sounds as though your vision of Israel is that this 20% should be sealed off from the other 80%.
Maybe they need to go to Australia.